Hi guys, we'll devote today's lesson to studying a filter called a camera raw. This word implies in our case a raw file. This is let's continue our conversation about the wonderful camera raw filter. We will look at a few more of its features. Let's look at the toolbar, which is located at the top. I want to remind you that you can work with both RAW and JPEG files. But if you are working with a JPEG, then some of the tools will not be available to you. And the very first tool is the zoom tool. It zooms in and out. So I just click and the image is zoomed out. When the Alt key is pressed, we move the image away. Next comes the hand tool, which works the same way as in the Photoshop. The next tool is the white balance tool. Basically, with it we get the same result that we got when adjusting the white balance manually. Let's take this tool. We need to choose a white point and a black point for a good correction. So let's set the settings so that we can see before and after. And let's get to work with this tool. When we point the eyedropper at white areas of the image, then we see the numbers denoting this color next to the histogram. And of course, in order to select a white area, we need to select RGB values close to 255. If we choose a black point, then we need a 0 value. But if we choose the gray point, the value will be close to 80. Let's start with the white point. For example, I put an eyedropper here. And look, I can navigate through the image and select the whitest area, focusing specifically on the RGB value under the histogram. Alright, let's choose this side. I click. The image here has been adjusted a little bit according to the white balance. Now select the blackest area and look for the maximum value, tending to 0. Well, let's say like this. I click and now I have to adjust the image, also in black color. In principle, this image has a good white balance initially, therefore the difference is not so visible. But in general, I want to say that it's not always possible to adjust the white balance in this way. As a rule, after all, when working with the settings that are on the right, you can still get the best result. Or you can work with the tool first, and then refine the result using the settings on the right. Next we have an eyedropper, which is called a color sampler, and it is intended for color correction. You can put some number of points to fix the color value. All these values of colors are displayed here, and in the future you can use this data for color correction. Well, for example, you want some color to remain unchanged. You can always look at the value of this point and check whether this color has changed for you. In order to delete a point, you need to click on it with the Alt key pressed. There can be quite a lot of points. By the way, as many as you want. So, with the Alt key pressed, I click, delete the points which I put. Let's move on to the next tool. It's quite an interesting tool, which is called a targeted adjustment. This tool can work in different modes. If we right click on the image, we will see that we have a parametric curve, hue, saturation and luminance. Well, and there is the ability to work with a black and white image. Let's start with the parametric curve. In fact, this is an analog of the curve that we have in Photoshop. Well, something like this. We take this tool, hold down the mouse button and swipe through the image. You see how its contrast changes. By the way, the histogram and the curve itself are changing. And you can swipe right, left, up and down. So you can also work with the settings that are under the curve and somehow adjust them manually, if you deem it necessary. You can also move the histogram directly. You see, I use a tool, and it changes. Right now I have made an overexposure. As you can see, this point is highlighted, which means a loss of quality in colors. And we can just move the histogram so that it disappears. The same goes for shadows. If our histogram goes too much into the shadow, then we have a warning point about loss of quality in shadows. And it's better to bring the values of the histogram back. I'm doing this now by holding down the mouse button and just moving the histogram manually. This is how the parametric curve works. I think you can handle it easily. Next we have a hue. That's pretty interesting. By the way, the value in the settings panel immediately switched to HSM. And here we can adjust the colors, both manually and with the help of the same tool. I put the cursor on the sky, press the mouse button and start swiping left, right, up and down. Well, nothing happens if we swipe up and down. Swipe left and right and choose the shade of the sky that would suit you, and immediately the value of the blue slider changes if you pay attention to it. So, what kind of sky should we make so that it still differs from the sky that we originally had? Okay, well, let's say I stopped at a sky like this. For example, I want to change the color of the herb. And I put the cursor here. Hold the mouse button, move left, right, the color of the herb changes, becoming either more yellow or vice versa, more green. But at the same time, however, the yellow shades are also changing, which is very good. Well, you can try again. No, I don't want to lose the yellow shades, but I, on the contrary, want to make them yellower. So I'm going back to the yellow shade and working on it now. I do this using the target adjustment tool, but it can be done in the same way, using the HSL settings. Well, let's say something like this. Let's look at the next parameter. It is called saturation. Immediately there was a switch here. That is, you could choose by simply clicking on this icon. And here we can change the saturation of our shades. For example, we can make the sky more expressive, and we can also somehow highlight the herb, for example, and it will become more saturated. Next we have luminance. You can also adjust it and pick up some values that will suit you more. Another interesting parameter is the detail. Here we can add the sharpness. In general, of course, it is best to add the sharpness at the very end of your work, after you have done all the work in Photoshop, for example, because the loss of quality when sharpening cannot be avoided. But if you still want to do it, then you can add the sharpness in this way. Well, let's leave it like this, for example. Well, here you can work a little more with the settings, of course. Choose a more suitable option for you. But I think that in general you understand how this tool works. You choose one of the settings you need, and by moving the cursors, or by using the settings themselves, select the parameters you need. Next we have a crop tool. It works exactly the same way as in Photoshop. That is, you select some part of the image by clicking, and the image is cropped. I will go back, I won't do it. The next tool we have is straighten. We have already used it in Photoshop. It works the same way here. Let's open another example and see it in more detail. And as for this example, I will press Shift key and open as an object in Photoshop. Like that. Here I have a smart object. I might want to do something else. Consider the straighten tool. Of course, it is most suitable in those cases when you just took your picture a little unevenly. But I didn't find such an image in the raw format, so we'll take this image and try to align it relative. So I take this tool. It works similarly to what we have already seen in Photoshop. I hold down the left mouse button and I draw this line, and the cropping occurs. Then I click twice and my image is aligned. Just like that. If you want, you can still modify the image somehow and work with its settings. But I'm not going to waste your time on this right now. I will open this image in Photoshop, so that later it can be saved in the JPEG format. Like that. I have it here, and we move on to the next tool. Let's take this image and try to correct its perspective a little. A tool called Transform is responsible for this. We choose it. We have a window of its settings, which is understandable, and you can easily set all the necessary values. Let's try to do it automatically. I click on the letter A, and now my image has already acquired a completely different look. If we change the scale, we will see exactly how my image was distorted after applying the setting. You can also choose how to distort. Distort images only horizontally, vertically, and in both directions, or set grids. All this is intuitive, so I won't stop there. I will just take the crop tool. So let's crop our image, so that we don't have any extra parts. Well, that's it. Click twice. Let's compare what we had before and what we have now. I think it's obvious. You can see how our perspective has changed. Well, in the same way, you can modify this image using various settings. I will not dwell on this for too long, so as not to take up your time. We have already considered all this. I will just open this image. So I have it. I can now save it in JPEG or add some other actions to it, if I need it. We still have a few tools left, but let's look at them next time, in order not to have too much information at one time. Today we'll have 3 homework assignments. The first is to make a correction of the image, the second is to align the image, and the third task is to align the perspective of this interior. We continue to look at the camera raw tools again. Let's look at the tool called Spot Removal. In fact, it is a retouching tool. So we took it. And for example, I would like to remove these gaps. I click. I get two spores. Two circles, I would say. The first circle shows the area I want to replace. It's a red circle. And the second one shows the area where I should take the sample from. Let's make another one. I click here. I get a red circle. And the Photoshop had already guessed what needed to be done. If the circles interfere with us, then we can remove this check mark and they will disappear. Although, in fact, of course, they remain. Sometimes we need to remove not some point, but an entire area at once. In this case, I click the left mouse button and start simply selecting the area that I would like to replace, like that. Photoshop suggests replacing it with the one we had before, but I have selected a very large area, so of course it's not good enough. So let me cancel. Ctrl plus Z. By the way, if we want to delete all of our created areas, we click Delete All and everything is deleted, and the image returns to its original appearance. Let me try to select a smaller area now, with the left mouse button pressed, like that, and find a suitable replacement for it. That's what I got. If you noticed on the right, we have a type. It can be heal or clone. If we choose heal, then the software adapts the overlaid area to the place we have chosen. And if we choose clone, then you see nothing happens. It's simply overlaid as patches. This option works as a clone stamp. I think it's better this way. Of course, you can adjust other parameters as well, for example, opacity or feather. Sometimes it is necessary. In this case, I think it's not a very suitable option. As for the size, this option only works when we put such a round area in just one click. Let's try again. I will click here somewhere. And by the way, I cannot only reduce the area by simply moving the border with the mouse, but by using the size option right here. But this option only works at the moment when we just start our editing and hold the cursor. That is, I can now enlarge and I will have a much larger area. Or I can reduce the size and this area will be much smaller. Thus, of course, it is much more convenient, after all, I think, just to move beyond the boundaries of the circle and already select this area at your discretion. Please note that we have an inscription, press or to automatically correct the selected area. What does this give us? For example, I put a spot somewhere. So, let me choose another one. I press slash on the keyboard, and this is how the Photoshop chooses the site from which it is best to take a sample. That is, here I choose a piece. I press the slash and in general everything turns out quite well. There is no need to strain yourself and select the area where you will take a sample by yourself. Also, using square brackets, I can increase, for example, the size of a brush. Click, then press slash. That's all. All the unnecessary pieces were removed. Using the example of this image, I suggest you practice with this tool and remove some of these pieces. And let me remind you that if at some point you decide to return to the original state, you can always press this button. So I cancelled everything, and let's look at the rest of the tools. Next we have a red eye removal tool. It works the same way as in Photoshop. If you ever come across photos with red eyes again, then by clicking this tool you can delete them. But it seems to me that you won't find such photos. Well, you never know. I will not show you this tool in action. And we had better move on to the next tool, which is called the adjustment brush. I think you can easily cope with the red eye removal tool. To consider the following tool, I suggest take a file of the JPEG format. In order to work in the camera raw with JPEG files, we need to use the filter that is located in the Filters tab. To begin with, we will convert our layer into a smart object. Converted. Then go to the camera raw filter or press the key combination Shift plus Ctrl plus A. See, there are the same settings. However, some tools such as crop or straighten are not available here. But now we are going to look at a very interesting tool called an adjustment brush. Let's take it right away. We saw a lot of settings. The essence of the work of this tool is that we create a masked area by painting over a particular area of the image with a brush, and we apply some settings to it. That is, the settings that we choose will be applied only to the area painted over with this brush. And let's use this opportunity to retouch this photo. I immediately turned on the before and after mode for greater clarity of our actions. So I'm zooming in, and we begin. I would like to make the girl's skin smoother. To do this, I will use a soft brush. There are parameters of the size, feather and pressure. The pressure shows the impact of this tool. And the more pressure there is, the more active the action of the tool will be. 50 is usually a normal value. Well, the size of the brush is adjustable. It is now like this. We can make it, say, bigger or smaller, or we can change its size using square brackets. Initially, when we start our work, we have all the parameters at 0. So, I click somewhere on the face and just start drawing with a brush. You see how immediately my skin becomes smoother. I think the effect is quite obvious. I hope that you can see. Using square brackets, you can reduce the size of the brush. OK, and carefully paint over. Cover up like this all those areas that we would like to smooth out. If we want to smooth out some areas more, then we can edit or remove this clarity. But we'll have to put another pin. We'll come to it now. I'll increase the size of the brush and work with the forehead. I try, of course, not to go into areas with hair, but sometimes maybe this happens. And in order to see where we have already applied the tool specifically, we can turn on the mask mode, and we will see those areas that we have already painted with a brush. In the same mode, we can also refine and finish painting some areas. Well, if we want to erase some areas, we choose the erase mode, and here we already select the appropriate size and erase those areas which we wouldn't want to be catched by the brush. For example, the hair. I'm not going to do this carefully now, but I think that the main idea is generally clear to you. If suddenly the color of the mask matches the color of your image, then you can click on this square and choose another color that will allow you to see your mask better. Well, let it be like this. OK. But in order to disable the mask mode, we simply disable it, remove the check mark, and that's it. Well, you can see that the face has become a little smoother. We can also increase and decrease the clarity, and it will decrease. Look, I'm moving it in the opposite direction, and everything changes a lot. That's how you can edit and remove clarity. Well, we'll find some reasonable compromise between the naturalness of the skin and such glamorous beauty. And let's see what else we can change. We can see, for example, edit a little glow by increasing the exposure. We can also work with the texture of the skin, smooth it out completely, like this, or on the contrary, to emphasize it as much as possible. Well, let me probably smooth it a little bit anyway. We can also work with shadows and lights. Well, this is at your discretion, as you see fit. You can, for example, emphasize shadow and light, and that's what we'll get. For example, we worked with the skin, and now I would like to lighten, for example, the whites of the eyes. To do this, I choose Create, and now I will choose a more suitable brush size. Well, that could be it, and I will try to paint over the whites of the eyes with this brush. But in order for them to become whiter, I will slightly reduce the saturation. So, I did it with one of them already. So, let's see now. Which one? I have already dyed one white, and perhaps here it is better to take a hard brush. You can reduce saturation and increase exposure. And look, the eye lightens up. The same can be done with the second eye. And I would like to change the color of the eyes. Then I choose Create again, click on the eye, I paint over the eye. OK, let's look at our mask. Well, let's say like this. Again, yes, I probably should have taken another brush. And for example, I can change its color. I click on this icon. So, let's choose some other color. Well, for example, like this. OK, that's it. Let's remove the pins, so that we can see better. Well, let's make the second eye the same. Of course, this is too much, but then probably you can try to reduce it. So, I will reduce the exposure, so that somehow it is not so catchy. Well, in the same exact way, You can create any number of pins and apply certain settings to the areas that you have selected. Thus, you can change the color of the eyes, or the lips, and add the sharpness of the eyelashes, added maybe some makeup. Well, whatever you want. I click OK and go to Photoshop. Now we can save the result. By the way, if you want to get different eye color, then just choose a different color. More suitable, less active perhaps, or work with the settings somehow. As you understand, this is the second homework assignment. The first one is to remove extra feed on the picture. Of course, this wonderful filter can be talked about for a very long time. It is worthy of a separate course, but we'll limit ourselves to the most important things, so that we can turn to the camera raw filter at any time and change the settings. We apply Convert to Smart Filters. Applied. And now we go to the camera raw filter. Filter camera raw. Done. So I immediately put before and after for more convenience of work. And let's move on to a tool that we haven't considered yet. It is called a graduated filter. So we take it. And in principle it is already clear from the name that this is something like a gradient. When we hold the line with the left mouse button, we get such a construction that shows us the distribution of the gradient. Here in this case it is like this. We use the Shift key when building the structure. Then we create it strictly vertically and strictly horizontally. In this situation I get a color distribution from orange, which you see here, to transparent. That is, a gradient is overlaid on a new layer, but it seems to me that the orange color here may not be quite appropriate, so I will change it to some other one. Well, for example, let's make a sky like this. Note that the gradient is still a mask. And if we click here, we'll see exactly how the gradient is distributed over our picture. And if in some places I would like to remove this gradient, then you need to go to the brush tool. I reduced it using square brackets. And for example, I would like to remove the effect. I'm doing it roughly, but I think you understand what I'm doing. That is, the sky has become more blue. Well, let's say I want to do something with grass. Then I select, press the Shift key and draw the gradient from below. So now I tint with this color, which we have tinted the sky with. But we can click and go choose other color. Well, for example, to make grass a little dried. At any time we can move our gradient, move it around the image as we like. Well, for example, maybe I would like to do this. And of course, in addition to the color, you can work with all other settings. For example, you can add a saturation if you suddenly want it, or on the contrary, remove it. And you can increase or decrease the exposure, temperature, color, and all other settings. That is, here of course, you just choose what you think is most interesting. If we edit the texture, the grass will become more drawn. If we remove it, it will be more blurry. And so, for example, we worked with a second gradient and realized that we had done something wrong with the sky. Then we can click on the first gradient and make it active, and for example, reduce saturation, or do something else. For example, if we try to remove the haze, the sky will become more expressive, and if we edit it, on the contrary, it will be some kind of cloudy. And there can be any number of such gradients on your image. You can also apply a radial gradient. We'll look at it now in other image, but in order to somehow still show you, I am drawing a radial gradient, and now it's toning with what is inside. You see, there is a button like this inside, and if we put it outside, then it will happen outside. And we can tone our images somehow, make such a kind of vignette. That's what we get. You can choose any color. So we can look at it without all these overlays. This is the picture we got. To be honest, I did everything randomly, without trying to come to any definite result. So that's the result. In fact, there are of course a lot of things that can be applied here, and all this can be very interesting if you see it longer. I'm using a brush. I want to clean, for example, grass. Here you can do it. I can clean the grass like that. By the way, here I'm now working with a brush with a minus sign, and I can return the mask action again, using a brush with a plus sign. That's how interesting it all works. That is, you can of course experiment, see what you will get here. Perhaps you will get something much more interesting. By the way, our radio mask looks like this. Click OK and go to Photoshop. And this picture has a mask, and we can still somehow work with the camera raw here. Remove some details of our image. Let's say we don't want to apply this filter on some details of the image. Then we can remove them. For example, here I have just selected a piece and the camera raw isn't applied here. And if we suddenly want to go back to the camera raw filter settings, click on the label camera raw filter. Our filter is loaded again, and we can edit something here again. Well, I won't change anything else now. Click OK. And I think we'll leave this example. Let's take this cat. Convert for smart filters. Then the camera filter. And we take a radial gradient. So, well, let me stop, choose a color. A warm one, like this. So I draw a radial gradient. This is a great way to create a variety of vignettes of radial gradients. We'll enable before and after option, so that it is clear what we had here. And now it is outside. And if I do it inside, and let's say edit exposure, then I have this kind of an alignment. So, for example, I will choose some cool shade, and then the cat will get this kind of mystical look. And it is inside. And if we do it outside, then the picture will change very much. And here we can also work with feathering. And then this vignette will either be very straight rigid, or it can be blurry, just like in the previous case. If we select Create, then we create another one, edit another gradient here. Well, let's say we'll make it inside and choose some other shade. Well, let's say, okay, let it be this color. You can make a strong feathering, so that there is just a such glare on the muzzle. Don't forget that we can choose the blending mode, and we can also modify the brush wherever we want. That is, for example, I can take and remove the effect of this action in some places. Click OK, go to Photoshop. And here I would like to draw your attention to this icon. We somehow didn't mention it earlier. This icon allows you to change the blending modes. Let's reduce the picture so that we can understand what is happening. And here we can firstly change the degree of opacity. Then we reduce the impact of the camera raw filter and make it less intense, which can be very useful. In addition, we can change the blending mode to some other one. Well, for example, on overlay, or for example on multiply, for example lighten. So, I think you have already realized how many opportunities you have. The main thing is to cope with all of them and not forget anything. As I said at the beginning, the camera raw is a very powerful tool that can be studied very long, and you will discover more and more new opportunities. This concludes our cycle about the camera raw. Let's move on to the homework. The first task will be to tone image, and the second one is to edit the image of cat. It was Peter Romanov and AIM School. See you next time.